Hey up, folks. Let's talk today about education. More importantly, let's talk about the destruction, deliberate destruction, in my opinion, of working class education in Britain. Now, I'm not going to claim that 60 or 70 years ago there was a golden age of working class education, because there wasn't. And I'm not stupid enough to lie. Education, state education, was as crap then as it is today. So nothing really changes. State education, schools, really about providing employment for the thick as pig shit middle class. It's not about educating kids. So, but nevertheless, there was, all those years ago, a supplementary education system, which is the one that's been destroyed. It started off with things like the extramural departments at universities, and it ended with the two working class Oxford colleges, Plater and Ruskin, neither of which exist today. Come to think of it, neither do the extramural departments at the universities. And I can't think of many trades unions that have an education department, such as the one that the Transport and General Workers Union had up to, I don't know, half a century ago. So, let's begin. I take the view, and I don't think this is a controversial point, that education is about directed reading. You give a question to a person and some readings, and off he goes and does the readings, and then you question him about the what he's read. I said this to somebody not all that long ago. Unfortunately, I've managed to forget their name. I said that education was directed reading, and he replied, "Well, who taught you to read?" He was obviously expecting me to say the school teachers, but I didn't. I told him the truth. It was my mother. My mother taught me to read, and the reason why she taught me to read was that she had to, because by all accounts, as I was on the third and final year of my infant school, so I would have been about 6 or 7, 1962, that sort of time, I couldn't read. So, by all accounts, my mother went along to the school and gave them a piece of her mind, and they tried to schmooze her by telling her that she needn't worry, that I would learn in my own good time. Would you like another biscuit with that tea, Mrs. Bell? And you did not try to schmooze my mother. She took no shit off anybody. So she decided she wasn't going to argue with those idiots. She was going to teach me herself. Now, she didn't know how to do it. She hadn't read a book on how to teach your son to read. She just figured it out for herself by trial and error. I can dimly remember that she would use street signs as we were going on the bus to Manchester city centre. She would point to a word and break it down into its syllables, and tell me the sounds that each syllable made, and then try to put them together in her own way to make a word. And then she would look for other words that had similar syllables in them, street signs, that sort of thing. And slowly but surely I began to connect the dots. And one fine day I found I could read. I remember years later asking my mother how long this had taken her, And she thought about it for a moment and said, oh, 2 or 3 months, which struck me as, well, reasonable. So I could read. And because I could read, both my parents and I really lost interest in school. When we went to Manchester to do our shopping of a Saturday, if I ever wanted a book, my parents never said no. They bought it for me. I remember, I think I must have been about 8 years old, and I still have the book. It's a history of the guillotine in France. I still have it. And around about that time, when I was about 9, maybe 10, I remember reading a novel by a man called Stan Barstow called A Kind of Loving. And I decided at the age of 9 that the hero, Vic Brown, was very much a wanker of note. And I did not want to be a wanker. At the same time, I read Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and I decided that the hero of that novel was very much a man after my own heart. And I wanted to be like Arthur Seaton, which was his name. Now, I can remember this because you see, Vic Brown was a grammar school wanker. And the one thing I did not want to be as I got into the fourth and final year of my junior school was a grammar school wanker. And I was absolutely terrified that I would take the 11 plus examination, which sorted out boys and girls into grammar school and secondary modern. I was terrified that I would pass the exam because, you see, in my mind, if you passed the exam, you had to go to grammar school and you had to wear the ridiculous uniform and the pathetic little cap. And more importantly, even than that, you had to stay at the school until you were 16. That's bollocks, of course, but I was only 10. However, if I went to a secondary modern, I may have had 4 unpleasant years, which I did, but at least they would end after 4 years and I could go off and earn a living. Anyway, I sat the 11 plus exam. God knows what I wrote, but I must have written the right things because they sent me to a secondary modern. And 4 years later, one Friday afternoon, I walked out of the place for the last time, and on the Monday morning, I started bastard work. What happened in those 4 years at the school? Can't remember. I remember I kept my head down, didn't get into trouble, got through it. But I carried on studying here for myself. Back in the 1920s, there were 2 scholarship boys a year at the Manchester Art School. And in one of those years, it would have been the early 1920s, one of those scholarship boys was my dad. Now, when I knew him, he was working as a labourer at Mather and Platt's engineering firm in Newton Heath, Manchester. But he did spend, I think, a year or 2 at the art school. He had a full scholarship, but the scholarship didn't pay for the materials that he needed. His father, Tom Bell, was a warehouseman, worked in one of the warehouses in Stevenson Square in Manchester, in the days when we had warehouses at Stevenson Square, Manchester, and didn't have much money. His mother was a housewife. She'd given birth to a total of 12 children. 8 of them died in infancy. So that left 4 for her to look after. And times were bad. So my dad, Charlie Bell, left the art school and left school and went to work. Nevertheless, even though he worked as a labourer in a factory, in his heart of hearts, he was still an artist. If we had to go to Manchester, he would always find an excuse to go into one of the art galleries. Now, Manchester is full of, it's actually the home of the Pre-Raphaelites, or the spiritual home of them. And my dad was much influenced by the Pre-Raphaelite school. And I can always remember him explaining a painting to me, discussing the use of shadow and light. And look at the water, how translucent it is in that painting. It was as if he was taken into another world. And he loved every minute of it. And I really enjoyed those afternoons with him. His brother, my Uncle Albert, was not a painter, but he was a literary man. And he used his gratuity money when he came out of the army in 1945 to set up a literary journal. It was called The Appeal. And by all accounts, it was doing rather well until Boxing Day 1946 came along, and with it the snow that didn't clear until the end of March 1947. That winter was one for the ages, and it meant that transport basically packed up. So I'm afraid so did The Appeal. Uncle Albert went off to work, as his father had before him, as a warehouseman. However, he was also a fellow who was determined that, again, you see, this is about education. Education is what you get because you can read. He decided that since the University of London had an external department, he would sign up for a law degree with the university, which he did. Now, by all accounts, the university gave him no help whatsoever other than a reading list. It was his job to go and buy the books, read them, and then answer the questions for the essays, which he bloody well did. And in the fullness of time, he got himself a law degree. So he was able to move from the warehouse to Manchester Council's law department, which he quite enjoyed, wearing a suit. So education was something that was ingrained in me at an early age by my parents and by the wider family, but not school education. School education was something that didn't count. Education was about broadening the mind. And I like to think that I had a good childhood and my mind was suitably broadened. I'll return to this in part 2, but for the moment, think on, folks.